Welcome to the second lecture in the Introduction to Philosophy series, P2 Elaborated Metaphysics. But first, let me say, if you're following the course of lectures here, this might be an occasion for detour. I have in my classes for some years now only one paper handout left, and this is it. Since we're online, paper isn't possible, so I've put that same handout in Dropbox, and you can download it as a PDF and either view it on your device or print it as you need. It's probably a good idea to print it because you can refer to it from time to time. You'll see why I suggest this if you see the YouTube video, and there is the URL for it's a separate YouTube video. So you might want to pause now and go there, view that one, and then come back. But here we go. Let me review a little bit about what I said in the introductory lecture. We're defining philosophy here in two distinct but related ways. Philosophy isn't as broad as thinking as such. Thinking is an anthropological universal we find wherever we find our species, Homo sapiens sapiens, as we like to flatter ourselves, or even other Homo sapiens groups. Far older than the mere 2,600 years or so that philosophy has existed, much more widespread. So not every culture has philosophy. In fact, it's really a minority thing. Every culture has thought, abstract thought, all kinds of things like that. So both our definitions, what I call P1 and P2, and once again, these are not standard terms in use. If you found another philosophy teacher and said, hey, what do you think about P1 and P2? They'd look at you. But if you explain the ideas, everybody would recognize the distinction that you'd be trying to make. P1 and P2, both of these are narrower than thinking as such. The second one, P2, which we'll now consider, is even narrower than the first. And there are definite reasons for this. We're going to explore what they are. Philosophy, in the sense P1, the Western tradition of rational inquiry as such, we've already seen this as a review. It begins in Greece around the time of Thales of Miletus. Now we turn to philosophy since P2, which again I define as the specialized tradition in modern academic life which treats of problems in one or more of three areas, and these areas are known as metaphysics, ethics, and epistemology. And I've not yet defined these terms, I will presently. It is the second sense, P2, that has more contemporary importance. So for example, if you're taking a course in philosophy, in the philosophy department, as opposed to the English department, you are doing philosophy in that second sense. Okay, the three branches, what are they? Metaphysics, ethics, and epistemology. Metaphysics, the study of being; ethics, the study of the good; epistemology, the study of knowing. So no longer are there any nature philosophers, as, for example, was Thales and his colleagues. They were in the days of P1 in ancient Greece. Those who study nature today are not scientists, or excuse me, are scientists. They are not philosophers. Again, I've drawn this little diagram. Basically, the numbers are approximate, but if we think about epistemology, ethics, metaphysics being roughly of equal importance originally to the ancients, to the Greeks, we see over time is that for a brief period, metaphysics takes a leap at the expense of the other two, but then epistemology comes back at the expense of the remaining two. If you use the periodization here, it's the same one that I use in the handout: the ancients, the medievals, the early moderns, and the moderns. Now, it's a cliche, but cliches are not always false, that the Middle Ages was an age of religion. It was an age certainly in which religion, and this again is a topic that's taken up in the handout talk, used philosophy in a big way. Think of St. Thomas Aquinas among the Christians, for example. The Muslims, the Jews also had similar developments. But if you have an access to God, you might want to develop a metaphysical understanding of God. You might want to develop some arguments to convince non-believers that God exists and exists in the way that your particular cultist believes that he does. You're not going to need really well-developed ethics. God knows everything. He knows what's right and wrong. Nor are you going to need a highly developed theory of knowledge, because once again, God knows it all. The modern age, early modern age, and the modern age, ages of science, again, a cliche. But if science is your big enterprise, then yes, you're going to need to focus a good deal on the theory of knowledge, on epistemology. Ethics kind of the stepchild in both of these developments, but squeezed in the middle. However, there's a big uptick in ethics in recent years for reasons that turn out to be quite surprising. We'll talk about that when we come to the section on ethics, because what we're doing now is considering these three in order. The current talk, of course, is about metaphysics, then we'll move on to another talk about ethics, and then finally one about epistemology. Don't know why this is popping up on me. Okay, there we are. So, so that's what this rough graph basically shows. And the way I set up the course, we're not going to start reading for a while. I'm going to talk for a bit to give you some concepts so that when we do get to the readings, and the readings will be the primary texts of the philosophers themselves, not a pre-digested textbook, you're going to have some conceptual tools with which to deal with them. And so we're going to look first at, again, as I say, at these three areas. Well, let's think about some examples first. What kind of problems does one take up in metaphysics? Well, here's one. Can I step in the same river twice? This was asked by Heraclitus, one of the pre-Socratic philosophers. Now, was he really interested in rivers? Well, what's a river? River is a couple of things. River is a place which is fairly unchanging. The Nile is the Nile is the Nile. Mississippi is Mississippi is Mississippi. But on the other hand, it's constantly changing. The water is constantly renewing itself. The banks are getting eroded. The river itself may change course. The Mississippi's done this a lot. The Mississippi that we see today is not the same physical roadway that Mark Twain navigated, for example, in his days on steamboats. And no, in a sense, you cannot, even if you go to the Mississippi, you cannot step in the same river twice, because the water where you stepped yesterday, for example, is gone down to New Orleans, probably by now. So really, he's not asking a question about hydrology or geography, is he? He's asking a question about continuity and change. So what extent can something be the same and still constantly be changing? Is that possible? How do we reconcile these two ideas? And this, of course, is the topic of which Plato takes stock later, following Heraclitus and some of the others. How is it that a surface may be absolutely smooth, but not absolutely bumpy? There are absolute terms and there are relative terms. Some terms admit of degrees, others don't. Pregnancy is an absolute term. Can you be 98% pregnant? No, you either are or you are. Well, smoothness is like this too. If a surface is smooth, it is absolutely smooth. If it's less than absolutely smooth, well, then it's not smooth. It's bumpy. But a surface can't be absolutely bumpy. I mean, it has a little bump. It has a big bump. It's still bumpy. There are degrees there in bumpiness that the smoothness does not admit. So isn't that curious? How some words can work one way and some words can work another way. Is time real? Well, of course it's real. I was born in the past and I'm going into the present, right? Well, there's what Bernie Russell called the 5-minute hypothesis. How do you know that you weren't brought into existence 5 minutes ago with all the memories implanted in you, with the growth of beard, as if you had been growing it for days, fingernails, et cetera, et cetera? It's possible, that an evil genius perhaps could have created you 5 minutes ago, implanted with all these false memories. Maybe there isn't a past, maybe there isn't a future, maybe the present is all we have, and the future is what we imagine, and the past is what we remember or think we remember. Or maybe there is past, present, and future. Maybe there's this one continuous flow and we're kind of in the middle of the flow. That's not at all clear. Is there human nature or is there none at all? Are we evil, wicked sinners doomed to perdition? Are we basically good folks who have just been led astray? Maybe there is no human nature at all. Big question. Here's one you've probably heard. If a tree falls in the forest and no one is around to hear it, does it make a sound? And if a man speaks and there's no woman around to hear him, is he still wrong? What's the difference between sound and noise? Is there a difference? And what happens if nobody's around to hear? Does that tree really still exist? Philosopher Leibniz takes this up. He thinks he has an answer to the question. We'll come to that later. Are wholes greater than the sum of their parts, or wholes less than the sum of their parts? the word bus and the word sub are composed of exactly the same letters, just in a different order. One of them can take a screen door, the other not so much. So what's the relationship there between whole and part? What's the relationship between words and things? Are words just arbitrary tags that we put on to things, or can words actually perform physical actions? Abracadabra, hocus pocus. Can we use magical words? Is magic possible? We tend to think it isn't. Other eras of thought, maybe it is. But it has to do with language. Yeah, here's one. God is supposed to be omnipotent, omniscient, and all benevolent, omnibenevolent. If that's all true, that package, well then, first of all, God already knows what's going to happen in the future. Indeed, by one account of God, he knows it because he predestined it. He's the author of it all. But predestination aside, if God already knows it, hasn't it already happened anyway? Is there indeed any future? You know, God's TV channel, it's all reruns, no new programs. He's already seen it all. Well, if that's the case, why would God or anyone else say to us, you ought to do something? Because ought implies can. And if you can't do other than what you're doing, what's the point of saying to you, you ought to do this, or you ought to do other than this? Why even try? Faith and reason, again, this is a topic I take up in the handout talk. Is faith merely blind? Or is the existence of God, for example, something that could be proven? Can people argue rationally about religious topics? Can God's existence be disproven? Is God's existence beyond all proof? And here's probably the hardest question of all. Warum gibt es etwas und nicht nichts, as Heidegger asked? Why is there something rather than nothing? I mean, here we are. We think we're something, there's something here, but we could imagine that there might never have been a Big Bang, for example. There might never have been anything. Instead of things existing, nothing might exist at all. Why is it one way rather than the other? Does it have to be? Could it be otherwise? Is there anything we could not know? And if so, would we know that we cannot know it? Again, this is metaphysics, but it gets into, because it talks about knowledge, right? It gets into epistemology. Some say metaphysics always involves epistemology, perhaps. Okay, so here are some examples of problems in metaphysics. Let's look at examples of problems in ethics. When we say that so-and-so ought to do X, and ought is the operative word for talking about ethics, are we actually saying something with content, or are we just bleeding shoulda, coulda, woulda? Are we making a sensible assertion? Got a question for you. Why is a mouse when it spins? Why is a mouse when it spins? No, that's not you, it's me. Am I making sense? No, I'm not making sense. Even though I'm using English words, every word that I just uttered is in the dictionary. Why is a mouse when it spins? They're all there. But the combination, the whole is less than the sum of its parts, if you will. Combination doesn't work. I'm just chattering nonsense. It sounds like I'm speaking, but actually I'm just going yada, 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 blah, 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 bar, bar, bar. Well, there's a point of view that says that when you say ought, that's exactly what you're doing. You're not really uttering a sensible statement like today is Friday. It just happens to be today where I'm sitting. Whatever date it is when you are, that's either true or false. I don't know. Well, Washington, D.C. is the capital of the United States. That's sensible. That's verifiable. But that I ought to do something? Maybe not the same order. Does ought imply can? Immanuel Kant tells us that it does, but there have been times and places in which people have been punished, for example, judicially, for doing something that they might not have intended, they might not have done other than they did, or intended to do other than they did. The famous notion of an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. If I knock out somebody's eye, the punishment is I get my eye knocked out. But it was an accident. I didn't. It's different if I accidentally knock somebody's eye out as opposed to deliberately blinding them. No. From one point of view, that doesn't matter. We think it does. Can is ever decide ought? This is known as the naturalistic fallacy, to think that it can. There's a lot of that going around today. Ever hear the phrase? I hear it a lot. Well, we're making data-driven decisions, not just data-informed, but the data is telling us what to do. Okay. Philosophers have big difficulty with that because we happen to think that it's not easy at all, if it's even possible, to go from an is statement, a statement about how things are, data, for example, to an ought statement, a statement about things which we should do, as opposed to things we shouldn't do. Does good, the word good, when we say something is good, does that mean anything other than what pleases the gods? Abraham and Isaac. Abraham hears the voice of his God telling him to sacrifice his only son. He goes up to the mountain. He's ready to do it. Well, Abraham believed God, says St. Paul, and it was counted unto him for righteousness. And not only St. Paul's Christianity, but Judaism and Islam all agree on that. Really? I mean, isn't killing your child about the most wicked thing one can imagine? And if someone else does it, we don't like this. In 1925, in Tennessee, a farmer heard a voice from the sky telling him to kill his 2 children, which he did. The state of Tennessee did not, as it were, account it unto him as righteousness. They put him in prison. Well, ordinarily, when people do the sort of thing that Abraham did, we say bad, 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 but Abraham gets a pass. Why? Well, the argument for that is, well, because he was following God's will, and God is the one who tells us what's good and what's bad. Well, but if God tells us something is good, which ordinarily we think of as bad, what's going on here? There's several problems. We'll come to those in the course of talking about these subjects. If there is no God, are all things permissible? So said Dostoevsky. Maybe, maybe not. Does moral knowledge make progress in the same way that scientific knowledge does? Scientific knowledge clearly makes progress. And we've learned a lot about the way the world works, and progressively and quickly, and particularly in the last couple of centuries, our views have radically changed, so that every schoolboy in our world pretty much knows how the universe is organized, knows facts of nature, that would have been out of range of the most educated people throughout most of human history. So moral knowledge progresses in the same way. In every way, in every day, in every way, we're getting better and better. Or are we getting wickeder and wickeder? Or is there some kind of mixture, perhaps? Does the growth of science and technology increase rather than decrease moral difficulties? We're now able, because our technology is based in science, to do things like transplant organs. Wonderful. We increase the lifespan for a lot of people, but organs are in short supply. So who gets the available organs? Should there be a waiting list? Should people be able to jump the waiting list if they have money? People's Republic of China routinely executes prisoners, trumps up charges in order to execute prisoners so as to harvest their organs for transplantation, and particularly for sale abroad for cash. This is a moral problem that we didn't have 50 years ago, but because of our increased scientifically based technology, and the science and technology, I don't want to suggest the same thing because they're not, but we're better at doing that now. But we have some more problems. Solutions breed problems, including moral problems. Is anticipating the consequences of our action the essence or the opposite of moral decision making? We'll talk about a famous example called the trolley problem by way of examining this sort of question. Is eating people wrong? And if so, why? Well, there are cultures in the world which say, at least as we would regard eating people is not wrong. Of course, I can't eat my cousin, but anything else out there in the forest on 2 trotters is tasty and fair game. Well, we don't happen to think that. We tend to define human persons as coterminous with our species, Homo sapiens sapiens, rather than with our local tribe or ethnic group or what have you. Not everyone has done this throughout all of human history. So we happen to think that eating people is wrong, but is it, and why? Do we have reasons for this? And then there's the big question, are there any moral norms which are universally true or universally binding? Or is it all just different strokes for different folks? Well, the cannibals prefer their morality. We prefer our morality. Himmler prefers concentration camps. Isaiah Berlin prefers kindness. So we can agree to disagree. Moral relativism is the heading there. Okay, so there are a number of questions also one can raise in ethics. And finally, that brings us to epistemology, the third branch. If science yields knowledge, and we happen to think it does, it's the most successful knowledge producer in human history, what happens when, as indeed it does, science changes? In 1996, an orca was observed to kill a great white shark for the first time. Now, previously, science told us, no, orcas do not kill great white sharks. And then, oops, all it takes is that one counterexample. Well, now we know that orcas do kill great white sharks. As a matter of fact, it's kind of like running the 4-minute mile when Roger Bannister first did that in the middle of the 20th century. It was a big achievement nobody done before. Then pretty soon everybody starts running 4-minute, not everybody, but lots of people start running 4-minute miles. And so after the first orca was discovered, people are paying attention. And now we not only know that they do, but orcas have cultures. An orca in the North Pacific is going to learn from its parents a different technique for killing great white shark than an orca in the Southern Hemisphere of the Pacific. So, yeah. Science changes, and what we thought was science in 1 year is now no longer science, is now thought to be not science because it's not true, it's false. In subsequent years, is this a problem? Depending on how one conceives of science, it may or may not be. Knowledge. Is it a special kind of belief, or is it something entirely different from belief? We tend to contrast belief with knowledge. I can believe something which is false. I believe there are unicorns. Well, there aren't, but I can believe that. If I say I know that there are unicorns, though, that's more problematic. Now, the standard way of defining knowledge, it's called the standard view, basically, is JTB, justified true belief. A belief is known if it's both justified and true, but it is a kind of belief. On the other hand, Sir Karl Popper says, no, that's barking up the wrong tree. We shouldn't define knowledge as belief in the first place. Knowledge is objective rather than subjective, even though the subjective definition of knowledge, starting with belief, doesn't just take all beliefs to be knowledge, but adds a few conditions. But Popper goes and run around that and says, no. The big mistake is to think of it as belief in the first place. So, we talk about the mind, we talk about the brain. Are they the same things or are they different? The brain is this wet meat computer that goes between these two flaps of skin on the side of my head. Is a computer just a dry mechanical brain? Or can computers ever think? Artificial intelligence is questioning for this. Is there any point in talking about the mind as distinct from the physical brain? Well, René Descartes makes a lot of this, as we'll see other people do, and of course it's implicated in this whole AI project. Can we ever build a machine which thinks? By the way, if we did, and we have not, computers don't think. Computers are still extraordinarily stupid, but it's possible. Lots of questions we're asking about consciousness, a lot of answers we don't have yet, either from the side of philosophers, a lot of philosophers do this, or from the side of mechanical engineers who do this also. But if we have a machine which thinks, then we would solve some really basic philosophical problems. And it would be nice to have an answer. We don't yet, but we may at some point. Can I know something and yet not know that I know it? I listen to a foreign language. If it's truly a foreign language to me, that's if I don't understand it. I have some sense that it's a language. I may even have some sense of which language it is, but it's not transparent to me in the same way that listening in my own language. If I hear some people speaking in my own language, I cannot help but eavesdrop. And with other languages, I can't eavesdrop. I can't tell what the content is, although I may think that it's a language. So I know something about those languages. They are what we might call objects of ignorance rather than objects of knowledge, pure full knowledge. So can I know something and yet not know that I know it? Is there more than one sort of knowledge? And the objects of ignorance is part of that. Believe it or not, Lennon and McCartney cannot read music. Okay. Do we want to say that they don't know music? No. They don't have a certain kind of music in their heads, but they do have music in their fingertips. Can you have knowledge in your fingertips? Is that knowledge? And the orca white shark problem I mentioned. Why is magic not valid? We happen to think it's not, but can we say why? Why can't one simply find the right words and affect a physical change by saying those words, which is what magic basically tries to do? And what is the relationship between knowledge and human interests? That's a whole big ball of wax in and of itself. So lots of problems. And this is only a small selection of problems in philosophy. But let's narrow down further and consider in detail a few selected problems in each category. We'll start, of course, this is today's talk, with metaphysics, which is, of course, the theory of being. The very word metaphysics goes back as far as Aristotle, and that's fairly far back, almost to the beginnings. Aristotle wrote a book, Physicae, physics, meaning natural sciences generally, and then everything that didn't fit there, he put into a second book called Metaphysica, from which we get our word metaphysics, what comes after or comes with the natural sciences. But some of the topics he discussed go all the way back to the pre-Socratics, the very earliest philosophers, and some of the questions they raised remain puzzles even today. Bertie Russell drew this distinction. Science is what we know. Philosophy is what we don't know. Well, metaphysics, that which accompanies science. Let's think about some metaphysical issues concerning some topics about which science might or might not have much to say. Change, time, causation, cause and effect, determinism and freedom, properties and predicates, and human nature. Let's take change first. I mentioned Heraclitus before. Does anything change, or is it just an illusion? Can you step in the same river twice? Time. What is time? Do events flow to us from the future, become present, and finally recede into the past? Or is it the case that all we have is the present, and the past and future are simply things we imagine in the present? Let me ask a question. What do historians study? Well, one way to define history, the study of history, is methodologically, historians study documents. And that's the traditional definition. In recent decades, historians have been doing more of what sociologists do and anthropologists as well, but classically that's what it is. However, the common definition of what historians do is that they study the past. But do they? Do they actually take a time machine and go back into the past, or do they rather find artifacts, primarily texts, but now they use a variety of other artifacts, so they're getting quite sophisticated at doing this, and study them in the present and then make backward inferences to the societies that might have produced those surviving documents? Well, it seems that they do the latter. They do study the past, but they study the past in the present. Causation. We find it very difficult to think without using the ideas of cause and effect. Suppose you go to your doctor and he says, well, sorry, you have this mysterious ailment and it has no cause. But this is stupid. Maybe the ailment is mysterious, but we assume that this is just because the doctor doesn't yet know what's causing it that he's puzzled, not because there is no cause to be discovered at all. Typically, we proceed from what Leibniz called the principle of sufficient reason. Everything must have causes. Everything must be explainable in terms of its causes. There are no such things as brute facts, which just exist without any possible causal explanation. We may not have the causal explanation yet. That doesn't mean that it's not there to be found. Now, important to make a distinction here. Leibniz's principle of sufficient reason, everything happens for a cause, is not the same thing as saying everything happens for a reason. Causes concern how, that's a very different question from why. And you know, next time somebody says to you, everything happens for a reason, good thing to do is to punch them in the face and say, this was meant to be. With cause and effect, we assume that X causes Y. Simple causation, because Y has a cause doesn't mean that the cause was either planned or just. Or we can say that X causes Y, and this was in some sense planned. There's some kind of larger scheme behind it. And we might add to that the view that not only is it planned, but that plan is somehow justified and good. It might be the case that only number 1 obtains and 2 and 3 don't. People who want to argue for 3 or carry on in terms of 3, of course, that is nested within 2 and 1 usually as well. But it is possible for there to be simple cause and effect. This is Leibniz, sufficient reason, without there being either a plan or justice involved. And that's what the, everything happens for a reason wants to take a little further. That's right, Kenji, everything happens for a reason, but nobody has a clue what it is. But what exactly is causation? David Hume in the 18th century suggested that causation is really elusive. We have a psychological expectation that things are going to cause other things because they follow upon, because one follows upon the other, the effect follows upon the cause. But we don't know that. It's psychological expectation, not the same thing as epistemology, not the same thing as knowledge. Determinism and freedom. If we think about causation and think about time, together we may arrive at the very important metaphysical problem concerning determinism and free will. Are we free, or is there some sort of cosmic puppet master who pulls our strings from the outside? Choose determinism. Isn't that paradoxical? How can you choose determinism? If our actions are determined, have we any choice? Well, Kermit, says the doctor, I got some bad news for you. Your x-rays are back, and this may come as a shock. We assume that the mind or brain, if there's any distinction there, decides freely, then the body acts as the brain directs it. I think Kermit expects that's how he carries on. We see it a little differently. But is this so in general? I want to run a little clip for you from BBC 4 on Benjamin Libet's experiment that raised some disturbing questions about this. Let's just watch this briefly.
Put your hand in front of you and flex your wrist. You presumably first had a thought. Flex my wrist. That then caused your wrist to move. That's how it seems. But Benjamin Libet's experiments in the 1980s have cast some doubt on that. In his neuroscience lab, he wired up subjects to an EEG machine measuring brain activity via electrodes on their scalps, and then asked them to choose to perform a simple hand movement when they felt like it. He also got them to record the time at which they made a conscious decision to move their hands. Disconcertingly, he found evidence of brain activity initiating the movement hundreds of milliseconds before the conscious decision was reported. In other words, his experiments seemed to show that the conscious decision didn't cause the movement. The brain activity bringing about movement started before the individual willed anything to happen. Some people think this is proof that free will is an illusion, that our conscious decisions are more like reports on what is already happening than the causes of our action. Libet didn't go that far. He thought that we might not have free will, but there's still time for what some have called free won't, a conscious veto of an action that is started in the brain. Others are more skeptical about the implications of these experiments. They point out difficulties of recording the time of a subjective decision to move, and question whether Libet's findings could apply to more complex conscious decisions based on reasons, such as the decision to reject the claim that Libet's experiments undermine our idea of free will.
Free will or free won't. So, do conscious intentions cause brain activity, which then leads to action, or does brain activity cause conscious awareness, which then leads to action? Can the brain, prior to consciousness, cause subsequent consciousness? Determinism. Here's a definition. The view that the state of the world at any instant determines a unique future, and that knowledge of all the positions of things and the prevailing natural forces would permit an intelligence to predict the future state of the world with absolute precision. Once the chain of causes and effects was initiated at the beginning of things, it's like falling dominoes. Things would unfold as they must. This comes up, for example, in questions about God. I suggested this a little earlier. If there is a God, aren't we determined rather than free? Aren't we puppets like Kermit? God is omniscient. If he is, he knows everything, then he knows the future. He knows that the cop is going to catch the robber. Robber's going to go to jail. If there is a God, one of the things which must be true about him is that he exists eternally. He's outside of time. So every event is equally present for him. Everything that for us is going to happen, for him has already happened. That's why he can know in advance of us. So God is outside of time and views all events as occurring now. In other words, nothing new on his cable channel. Well, this is a temporal paradox because what it suggests is that for any event A both happened and has not happened. That seems to be a contradiction. God says, don't worry about your future. He's the author of your story and he's already written a final chapter. Well, maybe it's not a happy chapter. Your future spouse has already been chosen for you by Allah. It doesn't make any sense for you to cry for someone who doesn't belong to you. Allah's going to work it out in the end. But maybe my predestination is I'm going to hell on a full scholarship. If determinism is true, does it make any sense to speak of freedom? Could anything be different than it is? If the thesis of determinism is true, then there would be no alternate futures, there would be no alternate pasts, there would, for that matter, be no alternate presents for that matter. So here's what's really at stake. If the thesis of determinism is true, things are as they are out of necessity. They cannot be and cannot have been other than as they are or were. If so, then you and I are powerless to choose our futures. On the other hand, we must also be blameless morally for what we do because we can't have done otherwise. These two things go together. Now, philosophers are prone to talk about possible worlds and actual worlds, an actual world and possible worlds. Modal logic takes this up. This goes back again to this guy Leibniz I mentioned a little earlier. There are different possible worlds. There's an actual world in which we live, but it's one possible world among other possible worlds. It's the one that happens to have happened. What if every possible world is also itself an actual world? Science fiction writers have talked about this. Parallel universes, if you know, well, I'll come to an example of that in a minute. But what's even weirder is that quantum physicists are talking about the same thing. There's Schrödinger's cat, simultaneously alive and dead in parallel universes which don't touch. And this is a little bit technical. There's an interesting explanation on YouTube. I'll give you the URL there if you want to figure out what Schrödinger's cat is all about. But wait a minute, back up. Doesn't science necessarily imply determinism? You know, if we have scientific knowledge, don't we have knowledge of a determinate web of cause and effect? Well, some people have said yes. Claude Bernard, famous biologist, 19th century. Science, he says, admits no exceptions. Otherwise, there would be no determinism in science, and rather, there would be no science. Someone on the internet today, your future is already written. This is a little less literate than Bernard, but according to scientists, everything in our lives is planned. All events of life are somehow linked to universe. No matter how much you try, everything will occur as planned. We can predict 1% of lives. Scientists say the day we got details of all stars, we will be able to predict future by 99%. Not quite sure what that means grammatically, but I think I see where he's going with that. Determinism of this sort became very popular at one point in the history of science, following Isaac Newton in the 17th century and his laws. And that led people to ask the question, could there be a kind of Newtonian super science which understood all causes and effects, which predicted everything? In the 18th century, Baron d'Holbach famously argued, yes, it could. We can know the cause of all things and therefore know the future as well. Again, go back to our definition of determinism. Knowledge of all the positions of things and the prevailing natural forces would permit an intelligence to predict the future state of the world with absolute precision. So if you know alpha, then you know all the intervening causes, and then you know omega, the end of things as well. Marquis Laplace, this is sometimes called Laplace's demon. We'll come back to Laplace in another context, but a major scientist toward the end of the 18th century. We may regard the present state of the universe as the effect of its past and the cause of its future. An intellect which at a certain moment would know all forces that set nature in motion and all positions of all items of which nature is composed, if this intellect were also vast enough to submit these data to analysis, do we have supercomputers? It would embrace in a single formula the movements of the greatest bodies of the universe and those of the tiniest atom. For such an intellect, nothing would be uncertain, and the future, just like the past, would be present before its eyes. This is Laplace's demon, or maybe God is Laplace's demon. Is knowing nature like knowing the alphabet? Once you know it starts with alpha, the sequence is predictable. You know it ends with omega. Well, Newton thought nature conformed to static iron law that was timeless and eternal, and he famously formulated some laws. But the thing is, that was the 17th century. Science has changed. Comes along geology, comes along biology, 18th, 19th centuries. We begin to understand that life on planet Earth is not static and unchanging, has not been. It changed and evolved. Natural history didn't conform to eternal law, or at least that's not the end of the story. It seems to be a central claim in evolutionary theory that even perfect knowledge of the state of the universe in the past would not allow us to predict the present or the future. And that's because of a central feature of evolutionary change. It works by chance opportunities and local variation, and these things are random, not predictable. Blind variation plus selective retention. That is a good summary statement. Donald Campbell gives a statement of what evolutionary theory is about, not only in biology, but in other fields as well. Both selection and variation remain unpredictable. These events are local, they are chancy. For example, take Darwin's finches. We saw various finches in the Galapagos. An original species of finch might yield a variety of descendant species, some of which will survive, others will not. It's not determined which finches are going to emerge in the first place, nor which are going to survive in the end. Some of them are going to get crunched along the way, but that's impossible to tell from the outset. Random, unpredictable, undetermined events may occur with unpredictable consequences. Here's a perfectly good example. Dinosaurs. Dinosaurs lived from 233 million years ago until about 66 million years ago. About half the time there's been life on Earth. They were a major megafauna. But they're gone, or almost gone, maybe. There's a theory that birds are the surviving dinosaurs. The big ones were extinct. An asteroid strike in the Cretaceous in the area of what we now call the Gulf of Mexico created a situation similar to what would happen if we exploded a lot of nuclear weapons and created nuclear winter, massive cooling, blockage of sunlight, and this would have tremendous implications for speciation. Likewise, during the Cretaceous, when these dinosaurs were ruling the Earth, nobody would have predicted that these silly little creatures would take over. These are our ancestors, the mammals. The snow starts falling. This guy's already got his coat of fur, and the dinosaurs are laughing at him. But who's got the last laugh? So Newtonian physics in the 17th century may have seemed to support the kind of determinism that Baron de Holbach championed. But after geology, especially after biology, not to mention quantum physics, the Holbach's determinism doesn't hold up all that well in our own day. Random variation and chance in nature may or may not support the view that we have free will, but at the very least, it seems to undermine determinism. It seems to support indeterminism. Now, human free will is not the only alternative to cosmic determinism. Events might just happen by simple, stupid chance and therefore not be determined, but we might still not be free at the same time. In any case, metaphysical determinism, if it's embraced, has definite implications for ethics and for responsibility. H.L. Mencken, again, says more or less the same thing that Claude Bernard said. Mencken in the 20th century. Science is unflinchingly deterministic, and it has begun to force its determinism into morals. On some shining tomorrow, a psychoanalyst may be put into the box to prove that perjury is simply a compulsion neurosis, like beating time with the foot at a concert or counting the lampposts along the highway. My DNA made me do it. We're already at that day. You may have heard of the Twinkie defense. Actually, this has been a little bit exaggerated, but the notion was you can get a pass in court if your actions were out of your control because of some physiological circumstances. You can read and there's a hypertext link here to a very good Wikipedia article. You know, there are good Wikipedia articles, and there are some that are not. This one's pretty good. Again, as Kant says, ought implies can. To the extent that we're determined, to the same extent we're not morally responsible. So if I cannot do X, what's the point of telling me that I ought to do it, or of holding me to account either in a moral sense or a legal sense or in both for failing to do X, which I couldn't do in any case? Ought implies can. Jean-Paul Sartre comes along. He worries that therefore determinism provides moral excuses, bad faith. The devil made me do it, or my DNA made me do it, or a Twinkie made me do it. Sartre calls bullshit. And he has a metaphysics of moral indeterminism that allows us basically no excuses, although he thinks we want this kind of moral excuse all the time. That's another story. Think about law. It's a basic principle of law, at least modern law, that crimes have to be acts, actus reus. You can't be punished for a thought crime, at least not in modern legal orders such as we see in our own society. There are no such things as thought crimes. In order for something to be a crime, it must first have happened, past or present, not in future. But can there be any such thing as pre-crimes? This is a notion from the science fiction writer Philip K. Dick. He's actually very productive of strange notions. A pre-crime is a crime that, although it hasn't actually occurred yet as an act, it's going to do so predictably. If you know the film with Tom Cruise, what's the name? I'll come to it in a minute. This is not a new idea. In the 19th century, Cesare Lombroso, pioneering criminologist, suggested that criminals are born, not made. He thought he had a scientific way of determining this. Phrenology, the study of skull shape, was very big. Supposedly your skull shape is correlated with your moral and cognitive attributes. We don't think that's the case anymore. That's been discredited, but that was his day. And there, if you just analyze skull shapes correctly, you could predict criminal behavior. Minority Report is the name of the film I was thinking of. Precogs. Tom Cruise plays a precog. He can see in advance that you're going to do what you did. There is a program in the federal government now called TAPS, Threat Assessment Prevention and Safety, that is trying to predict in advance who's going to be a terrorist and stop them before they actually act in the way that we know that they must act. So pre-crime, it's not just science fiction anymore. We've been talking recently about red flag laws, particularly with respect to mass shootings. Lombroso's view of pre-crimes is a strong one. The red flags is a little bit weaker, but the notion is basically the same. In hindsight, we can see that a shooter exhibited certain behaviors in advance of the shooting, what are called red flags. You know, they tortured animals when they were children, or they talked in high school about, fantasized about committing a mass murder, and then some of these people, not all of them, but some of them do. So why couldn't the high school teachers have stopped it? Why couldn't the police have been warned that they're making these threats and therefore act on them? Now, 2019, a shooter kills 9 people in Dayton, Ohio. 7 years before in high school, he'd written a kill rape list of his classmates. He exhibited all the warning signs. So shouldn't he have been stopped? Well, hindsight is 2020. Foresight is probably 2019. Normally, the ACLU does not join forces with the National Rifle Association, but when Connecticut adopted red flag measures of the sort I'm talking about here, the state's ACLU said, "We are deeply concerned about its breadth, its impact on civil liberties, and the precedent it sets for the use of coercive measures against individuals, not because they are alleged to have committed any crime, but because somebody believes that they might someday commit one." It is a serious issue. Now, also implicated in the notion of determinism is the idea of reductionism. Velociraptor is a meme on the web now. It's a dinosaur. I don't know, philosophers, dinosaurs, who scratches his chin with his raptor claw and asks disturbing questions. Here's one. Atoms and particles behave in probabilistic ways, but our mind is made of atoms and particles, so can free will exist? This, of course, is a question of wholes and parts. You know, synapses make up brains, and they in turn are built on basic chemical and physical, built of chemical and physical building blocks. So doesn't the part constrain, or the series of parts constrain the whole? Newtonian physical determinism was a point of departure for someone like de Holbach for more general cosmic metaphysical determinism. In order for a causal understanding of physical reality to allow that kind of determinism, wouldn't it be necessary to show that complex phenomena are at base, quote, nothing but determinate outcomes of their simple underlying physical foundations? It seems that it would. Sometimes this is called, guess what, nothing butism. If it turns out that reductionism isn't true, though, how likely is it that cosmic determinism along the lines that Holbach or Marquis de Laplace thought would be the case? Nothing butism, reductionism, or irreducible complexity. Now, if you like, whole biological organisms can be reduced to their constituent atoms. So organisms are composed of organ systems. Organ systems have central organs. Organs are made of tissues. Tissues are made up of cells. Cells have a molecular structure, and molecules have an atomic structure underlying them. Okay, so wholes and parts, but is the whole nothing but the sum of its parts? Is the behavior of the whole just reducible to the behavior of the constituent parts? Is the whole just a heap of things, or is there a structure there? Aristotle asked that question that far back. Think about a machine. Is a machine just a heap of gears in some housing, or in the same way that a sack of potatoes is just a bunch of potatoes in a sack, or is there some structure? Does it matter how you assemble the gears, how you gear the gears in the first place, the ratios and so forth? Are there some other holistic components to the thing? Can a whole have properties which emerge from its complexities and are not just reducible to the constituent parts? We call these emergent properties. Emergent properties are those which arise through interactions among smaller parts which do not themselves alone exhibit these properties. In biological evolution, for example, properties do emerge which were not there from the outset, are not just reducible. Now, wholes and parts. Are the wholes greater than the sum of their parts, or are they reducible? Nothing but. Well, it depends. You know, for some wholes, emergence is not true. You know, kid adds one half and one half together and gets 1.5 and complains to the teacher, but didn't you once tell us the whole is greater than the sum of its parts? Well, it's not for 1 + 1 = 2. For some sciences, for some wholes, emergence is true. Ordinary table salt is sodium chloride, composed of sodium and chlorine in a precise ratio. Now, sodium is a poison, chlorine is a poison, but table salt is not. H2O, hydrogen and oxygen in a precise ratio. Both hydrogen and oxygen are gases. They're invisible, they're breathable. Water is liquid, it's visible, and it's not breathable. So clearly water as a whole has some properties that are not simply reducible to the sum of its parts, not just nothing but is it. Go back to organisms. They are composed of atoms indeed, but they're not nothing but their atoms. Organisms have emergent properties. Change occurs, novelty occurs. The whole is not, in this particular case, the sum of its parts. Identical iron atoms might constitute an organism one time, at another time a bridge. Who knows, but that the Brooklyn Bridge might not be composed of atoms that were in somebody's body at one point before it deteriorated. If you take a drink of water, every drop of water at some point passed through a dinosaur, was pissed out by a dinosaur. So every drop of water has at one point or another been dinosaur piss. When you think about the number of eons dinosaurs ruled the world, that almost has to be true. But surely there's a difference between Perrier and dinosaur, or any other piss. The nothing but way to get a date for Saturday night. The human body kit. Just put the atoms together, you know. She's only composed of hydrogen, carbon, oxygen, nitrogen, and various minerals. Not a problem. Now, I'm being facetious here, but reductionism isn't just silly nothing butism. There can be a serious point to it. Consciousness, for example. How is consciousness possible? The AI community and others are hoping to be able to show how it is that consciousness can be reduced to physical properties. And it's not been done yet. And if and when it gets done, it's going to be a very complex process. It's one of the big sets of problems that philosophers as well as other intellectuals are worried about nowadays. A big challenge to try explaining consciousness by reducing it to something much more basic. Because what's the alternative? Well, it's the little homunculus. Okay, so how do I see my egg frying in the pan? Well, there's a little man inside my head. Well, how does he see it? Well, there's a little man inside his head. No. If you're going to explain how it is that we have visual experiences and process these, and and even cook that egg, this kind of infinite regress to a ever growing series of ever smaller homunculi is not a really good candidate for an explanation. If all we end up saying that consciousness is nothing but a bunch of chemicals and firing neurons, we've not succeeded at reduction. We've not succeeded. We've not succeeded at explaining. We need to have something better than that. So, a good reduction of consciousness to physical properties would be something other than nothing butism, but it would still be a reduction. And again, not something that's happened, but something that might. We don't know. Yet to be seen. One of the great things yet to be discovered. So although Newton implies determinism and Darwin implies indeterminism, this isn't just a matter of biological versus physical sciences. The physical characteristics of planet Earth itself have undergone evolutionary change. If you were around at the origin of the Earth, you would die instantly. First of all, there's no oxygen. And oxygen comes about how? Well, it's the case that plant life evolved before animal life. Animal life needs to breathe oxygen, but plants produce oxygen. Oxygen got onto the planet because plants evolved long enough to build oxygen in the atmosphere. The sea also evolved, you can see, in various ways. Would not have been hospitable to the kind of life we know from the beginning. That had to develop. So if you were an intelligent visitor to Earth, let's say a Martian, at the beginning, you could not predict that life would evolve here at all on this planet, any more than a similar visitor who came at the end of the Cretaceous period could tell you that the mammals would take over and the dinosaurs would be gone. So the view of determinism, we'll go back to our dictionary definition, that knowledge of all positions of the things in the prevailing natural forces would permit an intelligence to predict the future state of the world with absolute precision, that wouldn't work. Wouldn't work in either of these instances. So, what do we conclude? Science tells us that some aspects of the universe are like falling dominoes, predictable chain of cause and effect. Others are like tumbling dice, unpredictable and chancy. It's both and. There can be novelty and emergence. The state of the universe today isn't like it was 1 second after the Big Bang. Earth's atmosphere today isn't like what it was in the beginning. We have unexpected new species that weren't there all along, and species have also gone extinct, and sometimes from unexpected events, like the dinosaurs disappearing with the asteroid. Genetic change is driven continually by random variation. So Claude Bernard and Laplace's demon are not knockdown conclusions by any means. Science does not give us an unequivocal view of determinism, and that's a big mistake I think that a lot of people make. I mean, I know I heard that in my intro philosophy class. We read Baron de Holbach, but we were also reading biology at the time, and that didn't the two didn't entirely jive. Even if science did this thing, though, gave us an unequivocal view of determinism, science still couldn't settle metaphysical issues, and I alluded to this a little bit earlier, the naturalistic fallacy. The science of right and wrong. Can science save us? Can science tell us what to do? Can we really have data-driven decision-making? Could just knowing enough data tell us what to do? There's a certain administrative mentality which goes under the heading nowadays of neoliberal governance, but I remember when I was a student, one of the most interesting books I read was by a guy named Noam Chomsky, American Power and the New Mandarins, the sort of people represented, for example, in the American federal government by Robert McNamara, who was going to solve problems in Vietnam by just having enough data, enough body counts and all this data, enough knowledge, and we'll be able to knock it. Well, how's that working out? It's not working out any better now for neoliberal governance either, because basically, so a philosopher would say, it's based on an initial fallacy. Nor does any knowledge of is automatically settle issues of ought. Again, it's a standard fallacy to say this, but it doesn't work. Human females have the capacity to give birth to children. True. Women are obligated to have children whether they want to or not. Well, that's as may be, but the second one does not follow unequivocally from the first. Notwithstanding, what science tells us about nature of the universe can shape metaphysics, even though it can't determine our decisions and can't, science doesn't just give us philosophy. We can rule out certain claims as false. We can rule out, for example, the claim that there's no chance, no novelty, no wiggle room at all. Science suggests to us that we need to rule out that kind of determinism. It gives us a different general picture, certainly than we got in the days of Aristotle, a different picture than we got in the days of Newton. Indeed, it changes a lot about how we view the world. There are intellectual revolutions, after all, accompanying science. So don't push the naturalistic fallacy in a fundamentalist way. There are limits. So this leads to the annoying question. Could things have been different than they are? Do present causes force future events? Did past causes force present events? Alternative history. This is a whole genre of fiction. Harry Turtledove, for example, asks the question, what would happen if the Confederacy won the Civil War, or if at least it was fought to a draw and the Union did not win? Well, this is what the map of North America might look like. The United States of America from sea to shining sea, but only in the north. The Confederate States of America from the Gulf of California to through the Gulf of Mexico and the Atlantic Ocean. The independent state of Washington, the Empire of Mexico, minus a couple of states which belong to the Confederate States, the nation of New Mexico, the independent nation of Desiree, Mormons settled that, the nation of Superior, north of Michigan, what we call the Upper Peninsula of Michigan now, the Dominion of Canada, etc. Very different map and different political reality. In fact, in 1862, Union soldiers discovered the secret Confederate battle plan in a bottle of cigars. This led to a decisive Union victory. What if they hadn't found that bottle of cigars? What if the Confederates had pressed ahead either to victory or to a stalemate? This is what Turtledove explores in his novel, How Few Remain. And he follows it up. What would happen in World War I? Well, here's the Confederacy during World War I. And they're fighting on the side of the British with the Canadians against the United States of America to the north, who is aligned with Germany. Okay, there's trench warfare along the American-Canadian border, the same devastating warfare that the French had on their northern border. Notice, by the way, in this picture, there's a black soldier in the Confederate Army in World War I. Well, the Confederate States decide to give freedom to some of the remaining slaves if they will fight in the war on the Confederate side. So, rather a different outcome. Robert Harris has a series of novels. Munich is the most recent one that talks about the Munich Conference in 1938, which divided up Czechoslovakia and eventually led to the Second World War. In the novel Fatherland, earlier novel, it's 1964. 75th birthday of Adolf Hitler, who's still chancellor, of course, because the Nazi regime was not defeated. President Kennedy, this is President Joseph Kennedy, John F. Kennedy's father, who had been a Nazi sympathizer, Axis sympathizer at least during the war, is going to meet Hitler in Berlin on his birthday and finally sign the treaty ending World War II. The Russians are still fighting, the Germans, but the Americans never jumped into it, fully never did invade Normandy. The British invaded England and Britain and established an SS Academy where Oxford University used to be. They hanged Churchill, but they let the royal family flee to Canada. And in the spoiler alert, in the process of this meeting taking place, somebody comes up with the discovery of the Holocaust, and that kind of changes even President Joseph Kennedy's mind. But again, a very different possible history from what actually happened. In this history, the swastika flag, that is still the national flag of Germany, is flying alongside the flag of the European Union on the Brandenburg Gate. Imagine Hitler being part of the EU. The Man in the High Castle. This is Philip K. Dick again. An interesting series on Amazon Prime. In this scenario, the Nazis got the atom bomb first. They used it on Washington, D.C., completely obliterated it. They took over the eastern and central part of the United States. It's the Greater Reich in North America, and the Japanese took over the Pacific states. They ruled there. The protagonist of the story, John Smith, was an American Army officer, but they were given a choice. Either you put on the swastika and join the new Nazi army, or American Nazi army, or you go to the camps. And he decided to join. He rises to the ranks, becomes Obergruppenführer, becomes eventually Reichsmarshal, the leader of Nazi America, and then I won't give the whole thing away. Now, the same person, John Smith, exists in a neighboring universe, a Lebenswelt, as they call it, as an insurance salesman. This is the guy who would have developed, had the United States, in fact, won the war, used the bomb first, won the war against Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan. And in this movie, both John Smiths exist simultaneously. There was a divergence, and you've got the John Smith, the Nazi Reichsmarshal, and the John Smith, the insurance salesman. And John Smith, the Nazi, travels back and forth between these two worlds. So they are Lebenswelten, they are neighboring worlds. What did the philosopher Martin Heidegger say? Every man is born as many men and dies as a single one. Well, here, I guess every man was born as one and dies as many. Richard Hofstadter, in this really interesting book, still well worth reading today, The Paranoid Style in American Politics, quotes Louis Namier, the British historian. The crowning achievement of historical studies, says Namier, is to achieve an intuitive sense of how things don't happen. It's precisely this kind of awareness that the paranoid fails to develop. There are two flavors of gullibility out there. One of them is the gullibility that believes everything it thinks. You don't want to believe everything you think, but there's also the gullibility which disbelieves everything. Conspiracy theories. Well, they want, that's what they want you to believe. Well, okay, you could always express skeptical doubts. Evidence would be nice too. Historians, like Darwinian biologists, if unlike Newtonian physicists, tend to be impressed by the purely gratuitous contingent accidents of history, like finding the Confederate cigars, or like Hitler's stupidity. Hitler was enormously stupid at critical points. He brought the United States into the European theater. The Japanese declared war on America. Hitler was allied with the Japanese. He just sat back and sat on his hands with it. He jumped right in and declared war on the U.S. Okay, well, that means the U.S. is coming his way. There's a famous talk by General de Gaulle. General de Gaulle was a big thorn in the side of the Americans and the British, les Anglo-Saxons, as he liked to call them. But de Gaulle was one of these audacious lieutenant colonels in human history who made a difference. He hops the last Piper Cub out of France, goes to London. He's condemned to death in absentia as a traitor. He gets on BBC and he broadcasts an address. Now, this address was probably not heard by many people at the time, but it's been reprinted subsequently. In fact, every public square in France you could go, there's going to be an enamel plaque there in the town square with General de Gaulle's address from London. He says, look, France may have lost the battle. France has not lost the war. Inevitably, the Germans are going to be defeated. Why? Because they face the industrial power of the United States. So the day will come when they will be defeated. And on that day, it is important that the French be there. So let us rise up now and resist. And that was his call to the French resistance. He had it nailed. Hitler had no clue. If you take on an industrial power like the United States, it will eventually prevail against you. And that's exactly what happened. Hitler's not so smart. Also, Hitler did not like Jews. And he did not like what he called Jewish physics. We want true Aryan physics, he said. Only German physicists. Well, guess what? A lot of the physicists were Jews, so they went elsewhere. They went to work for the Allies, some for the Russians, some for the English, some for the Americans. And who got the bomb first? Precluding the scenario that Philip K. Dick has, where the Germans got the bomb first. Hitler slept through D-Day. The panzers, the tanks could not be ordered up to the Normandy beachheads without Hitler's direct command, and nobody wanted to wake him up. So, might have driven the invasion into the sea. Didn't. You know, there was some sentiment in World War II that Hitler should be assassinated. There was also some sentiment that no, let's not do that, because if he goes, there's going to be a really competent leader on their side, and we don't need that. So, yes, purely gratuitous, accidental, stupid stuff governs some major historical events. Here's John Oliver on Hitler.
And only one thing that it's okay to admire Hitler for, and it's the fact that he killed Hitler. Look, everyone talks a big game when it comes to killing Hitler, but to be fair, Hitler is the only one who stepped up and got it done. And for that I say, way to go, Hitler. All the other Hitlering that Hitler did, thumbs down. But that very last Hitler of Hitler, thumbs up. And by the way, do not take that image out of context. look.
Part of Namir's intuitive sense of how things do not happen is a healthy respect for how difficult it is for any determinate human planning, including conspiracies, to unfold perfectly according to plan. What does Jean-Luc Picard say? You know, people are always, conspiracy theorists, always taking these dollar bills and showing you, oh, there's some Illuminati are putting, messages in here. Why would they do that on a piece of paper that every single person handles every single day? It just sounds kind of dumb. If things are going perfectly, beware, because it's an ambush. If, however, the thesis of determinism is true, then alternative history is just pointless. For the past, things could only have happened as they did and not as otherwise. Hitler and the Confederates had to lose. So why didn't Lincoln just go golfing, or why didn't Roosevelt just do his stamp collection? If you know alpha, you know omega, so there it's going to go. If somehow we could press the reset button on natural history, would it have to turn out in exactly the same way all over again? Is there clairvoyance? Clairvoyance means clear viewing. Is there a future to be viewed? How is your crystal ball working? Mine's not so good. And what about the present and the future? Suppose there were some super genius, either Laplace's demon or Wile E. Coyote or maybe God himself, who knew all the causal connections. Then he too would have to know with absolute accuracy about what would happen in the future, and clairvoyance and prediction and prophecy would all be possible. I got to ask though, how come you never see the headline in the paper, psychic wins lottery? Never happens. There are always these guys with little tiny shacks and beaded curtains, and I'll tell you everything. Well, theologians would say that God is exactly this sort of super genius. One of the traditional attributes of God is perfect foreknowledge of all things, the alpha to the omega. From a God's eye point of view, everything is predictable, and the reason is God himself foreordained it, predestined it. But if everything is already determined already, what's the point of God saying to me, for example, thou shalt not steal, because he knows I'm going to steal. And if you do, you're going to go to hell. But he knows I'm going to go to hell. If, as it may transpire, I do steal tomorrow, in fact, I've already done it. There's a pre-crime there. God himself already foreordained it. So what's the point of giving me the 10 commandments? Let's look at a clip from Mel Brooks.
Oh, hear me. All pay heed. The Lord Jehovah has given unto you these 10 commandments for all to obey.
Yes, how many commandments did Moses have? Maybe there were more than 10. Maybe he had to go back to God and say, God, they broke all the commandments. Can I have some more? Now, this is a perfectly general point, and it's not limited to theology. One way to interpret Marx, perhaps not the best way, and by the way, hold that thought, because the last lecture in this course is going to be about Marx, including the question of determinism there. One way to interpret Marx is to say that he has very strong determinism, that it's inevitable historically that a workers' revolution is going to occur. Capitalism is going to go down, socialism and communism and a better world is going to arrive. But the annoying question there is, if that's inevitable, why did Lenin need to form a vanguard party? Why do you have to agitate and bring about a revolution? Why not just, go golfing or collect your stamps or sit back, whatever it is that the communists do, and wait for it to happen? It's the very same annoying question as the question about the 10 commandments. So, clairvoyance, whether it's God with his foreknowledge, this guy with his crystal ball, super genius, Laplace's demon, etc. If there's any future available to be seen, then it's already happened. And then how can we make the future it's already made? Okay, so I've talked about some reasons why we might suspect that determinism is not what it's cracked up to be, that it's in fact not true, it's false. Supposing that it is false. Does this mean that free will is true? Is it possible to be both determined and free? Usually the thesis of determinism is taken to be a challenge to the thesis of free will. Suppose, however, that my actions are not determined. Maybe there are possible worlds. Maybe there are alternate futures. Maybe I can choose not to steal, but maybe things can happen that nobody, not even God himself nor anyone else, would foresee, and maybe psychics are liars? But if I am not totally, if I am totally determined, then I am not free. But is denying total cosmological determinism necessarily the same thing as asserting freedom? Might one simultaneously be free and determined? Okay, the philosophical position that free will doesn't necessarily preclude determinism is known as compatibilism. What if hard cosmological determinism is false and free will is true, and yet there's still a softer determinism at work? Could free choice be an illusion even if I'm not strictly determined in a cosmological sense? If I'm not free because of indeterminism, could I be unfree for another reason? I may be free to want this or that thing, but am I free not to want what I want? Responsibility presupposes freedom, which presupposes both that I can and that I could do otherwise, which in turn presupposes I could want otherwise. There's a whole chain of conditions. But what about that last condition? Could I want otherwise? Well, there are many people who don't think they can want otherwise than what they want. I have a good friend. When she and her husband got divorced, they both came to the realization that they thought that the other one wanted to have children, and in fact, neither of them did. I hear that's not an unusual circumstance. Okay, got a question for you. What's your dream job? Choose a job you love, and you'll never have to work a day in your life. The subject of lots of motivational posters. What does Steve Jobs say? Your work is going to fill a large part of your life, and the only way to be truly satisfied is to do what you believe is great work. And the only way to do great work is to love what you do. If you haven't found it yet, keep looking. Don't settle. As with all matters of the heart, you'll know it when you find it. I want one of those jobs where people ask, do you actually get paid for doing this? Choose a job you love and you'll never work a day in your life? Yeah, but do what you love and you never work a day in your life because that field isn't hiring. Sorry, the lifestyle you ordered is currently out of stock at Amazon. How about this as an answer to the question, what's your dream job? My dream job is not needing one. If you ask Charles Bukowski, the great drunken Los Angeles poet laureate, used to hang out at the King Eddie Saloon. By the way, you should visit the King Eddie Saloon. It's a trip downtown LA. How in the hell could a man enjoy being awakened at 6:30 a.m. by an alarm clock, leap out of bed, dress, force feed, shit, piss, brush teeth and hair, fight traffic, and get to a place where essentially you made lots of money for somebody else and were asked to be grateful for the opportunity to do so? And let's go have a day drink at the King Eddie Saloon. Think very carefully before answering any question. Sometimes the terms in which the question is framed are not ones you should accept. Think about the old wife beating question. Have you stopped beating your wife yet? Don't wait for the translation. Answer the question. Well, if I answer yes, I'm screwed. If I answer no, I'm screwed. The old wife beating question turns out is a complex question. That's a kind of logical fallacy that assumes three things simultaneously to be true. If those three things are not simultaneously true, then the question loses its point. You have to be A, a man, B, married, and C, have beaten that spouse on at least one occasion. Of course, nowadays you could be a woman and have a wife, but that's not that. And if those things are not true, then to answer that question, yes or no, is pointless. By the way, not so much now, you guys are freshman, sophomore, as you go up the ladder of schooling, if you do that, junior, senior year, graduate school. Part of the point of asking an essay question might be to misframe the question and get you, the student, to reframe that question in a better way. So, a good answer to a complex question might be, well, I don't know what you're asking me here. If I interpret the question in manner A, then I would say yada, yada, yada. But if I interpret the question in manner B, then I would say da, 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 da. But it's hard to tell which is intended here, A or B. Okay, so yeah, think about the question. Question the question. It's good advice generally, not just for exams. Certainly question the question that's being asked of you when someone asks an old wife beating question, and that's something of that sort. Work, what is it? Is it a moral value? Is it a curse? Should I want a dream job, or should I say my idea of a dream job is not having a job? We talk about the work ethic in our world, the Protestant work ethic, as it's sometimes called. Hold that thought, we'll come back to that in a minute. Why do we have a work ethic? Why do the words ethic and work belong in the same phrase? Why is work something that gives us a sense of our self-worth? Why is work something about which we moralize, as we look down on the unemployed? We ourselves feel lost or worthless when we're out of work. My son's a chef, very good chef. He's right now, as they say in Hollywood, between jobs. And he's confident in his skills and he knows what he's doing, but he's feeling it. He's feeling the loss of being between jobs. It's a very common feeling in our world. Why do we think of work as a form of slavery instead, wage slavery? Now, wage slavery is not literal slavery, but it's still kind of an adverse condition. Ever been on a job interview? What if you answered honestly? This is what would happen. Interviewer says, what's your greatest strength as an employee? I'm willing to perform services in exchange for currency. What is your greatest weakness? I require shelter and calories to maintain existence, and thus I must perform services in exchange for currency. Why are you interested in working at this company in particular? This company pays currency in exchange for the performance of services. Where do you see yourself in 5 years? Performing comparable services in exchange for more currency. Dream and job in the same sentence. Where does this ever come from? We should distinguish here between two kinds of wants, what we can call first order wants and second order wants. That is, I may be free to want any job I can imagine. What's my dream job? To be a psychiatrist, or to be a social worker, or to be a teacher, or any number of things. Second order wants, am I free to want, not to want to have a job at all? What's my dream job? Not wanting to have a job. Is it possible that we could be simultaneously first order free, but second order unfree simultaneously? Well, think about the cow before the slaughterhouse. She has the illusion of free choice. She just a choice, first order choice, left or right. But since both first order choices constrain her toward the same destination, is that really a choice in the end? Does the cow have a choice about whether to go to the slaughterhouse? That's a jokey reference, but here's a serious one. In the current economic circumstances where gig economy is becoming the new normal, John Lanchester, interesting writer on economics, I'm learning a lot from him. Young people in particular feel they're living in an economic system rather than a political one. They think about jobs and paying the rent and whether they will ever own a home, and increasingly about student debt. And they don't see politics as having anything to say to them about those issues. That's because the economics are the same, irrespective of which political party is in charge. So sure, you have a first order choice about careers, but it's second order rigged. We have two right-wing parties in this country. So we have two parties in this country, and we have a right-wing party, and we have an extreme right-wing party. The right-wing party called the Democrats, the extreme right-wing party called the Republicans, and about economic austerity, gig economy, that kind of stuff. There's really no substantial disagreement. There are no political solutions at that level. Do you want a lot of kids, or do you want just 2.5 kids? Well, here's the script. Put your face here. You go from childhood to career, get a house in the suburbs, start a family, then you glide into your golden years. And there's no choice, according to that script. Of course you're going to have children. I can't believe I forgot to have children. Why do we say childless? Why don't we say child-free? Helen Mirren has an interesting thought on this. I love children. They're so funny and so sweet, but I never wanted my own. I've never had a moment of regret about not having children. Well, I lie. When I watched the movie Parenthood, I sobbed for about 20 minutes. It was about the whole story of being a parent, how it never stops, even when you're a grandparent. I realized I would never experience that. And for about 20 minutes, I sobbed for the loss of that and the fact that I never experienced it. And then I got over it. I was happy again. Lots of pressures to have children. Mothers want grandchildren. You know, if maybe a grandmother, they'd be too busy to nag you. So, when are you getting married? And how many spouses do you want? How about this? How many gods do you want? Well, let's see. Different people have different gods. You know, this guy wants you to have his god, but maybe you should step back and ask the question, which god do I want? How many gods do you want to worship? You have a choice, either a ton of them, only one, or none. If you decide no gods, well, the next question is, are you rich and insane? If the answer is no, be an atheist. If the answer is yes, be a Scientologist. What if you want a ton of them? Well, let's see. Next question, do you want to be reincarnated? No, then become a Mayan. If you want to be reincarnated, yes. Next question, do you want a black cat? Yes, become a Wiccan. No. Okay, next question, do you prefer Indian takeout or Chinese takeout? Indian takeout, be a Hindu. Chinese takeout, be a Buddhist. What if you only want one god? Okay, next question. How do you feel about bacon? Yeah. Or I love bacon. Well, if you love bacon, next question is, are you a naturally annoying person? Answer, no. Be a boring generic Christian. Yes. Next question. Do you believe underwear can be magical? No. Be a Jehovah's Witness. Yes. Be a Mormon. You don't love bacon. How about hummus? Yeah, be a Jew. I love hummus. Be a Muslim. See, that sorts it all out. You know, if only you think about having a choice. But with religion, most people don't. They adopt the religion in which they're born, or maybe in rare instances they convert to a parallel religion somewhere nearby. But at the second order level of choice, nobody really ever asks this question. If second order wants to determine, does this box in, does this restrict my ability to want in a first order sense? We're considering this as a problem in metaphysics here, but it might also be considered as a problem in social psychology and a problem in power, about power. If we're socialized into our culture, which defines certain things as desirable and leaves other things outside the realm of possibility, do we have a choice? Polygamy, unthinkable. Childlessness? It is culturally undesirable to be unemployed. There's a moral stigma attached to joblessness, just as there is to say polygamy. But within those second order bounds, one must be employed, we are told. We have lots of choices, first order choices of careers. The sky is the limit, whatever you want to do. In this case, freedom of choice would be bounded at the level of second order wants and not entirely unbounded. You're not free to choose joblessness. Let's use another example. Suppose your culture tells you, you must wear hijab. But within those bounds, you have many choices. Look at all the diversity. You can wear just a simple dupatta or simple hijab with your face open. You could wear a chador, which your face is still open, but you cover a little more of your body. You have the choice of a niqab, it's a veil over your face, or you can do full burqa. Wait a minute. Do the words diversity and hijab even belong together in the same sentence? First order wants, niqab, chador, burqa, whatever, are constrained by a second order determinacy that some hijab must be worn. Culture enforced by the religious police. Here's an example of an Iranian policewoman accompanied by a policeman stopping a woman on the street and chiding her for not being sufficiently covered, just having a headscarf. This dictates some very narrow constraints within which then you might be given a little bit of latitude, but there are still some very strict, a shell of very strict restraints. Now, choice can be restricted. Can choice ever be infinite? Can it be completely unrestricted? Freud makes the case, Civilization and its Discontents, that all cultures have some repression. All cultures have some restriction of choice. They channel desire, they block things, etc. And if Freud is right about this, it may be impossible to have an infinite range of choices, but short of infinity, might there be an expanded range of choices? Herbert Marcuse, famous criticism of Freud. Well, okay, given that we may need some sexual repression, do we need all the sexual repression that we've had in the past? Is there such a thing as surplus repression? Can we still have civilization within some sorts of boundaries without, let's say, having the very, very repressive sexuality of Victorian times, with which we've subsequently dispensed? Man is born free, says Rousseau, but everywhere he is in chains. It's conceivable that we may be both metaphysically free, not strictly determined, and yet not in fact free, because there's something else which restricts us. And this something else may be external in the sense of sociocultural conventions that box you in, box in what's considered the acceptable range of choices. Do you want lots of kids or just 2.5? How many spouses do you want? What gender does your spouse do you want, etc. But constraint may also be internal and even self-inflicted, insofar as we may internalize sociocultural conventions and continuously make them our own. Hold that thought, because when we get to the end of this course, we're going to talk about Hegel. That's the next to the last lecture. And Hegel talks about the prospect that in addition to actual slavery, there may be masterless slavery. That is, slavery in which we bind ourselves rather than being bound by some external force. Are we only unfree if and when the constraint comes from outside ourselves? Literal slaves have masters. Can there be masterless slavery? What does George Orwell say? Circus dogs jump when the trainer cracks his whip, but the really well-trained dog is the one who doesn't need the whip. And isn't he a good dog? Why do they call them Dachshunds? Because they're driven. Okay. Escaping the bondage of second-order constraints might be more difficult than one might at first imagine. Ever heard the phrase, think outside the box? Think outside the box. This is a chestnut of motivational seminars. Corporations often use this kind of thing for staff development. The notion is the corporation is going to benefit by having its individual employees think outside the box rather than following orders from outside and on high. Be an individual, expect the unexpected, abandon convention, escape, be free. That's what we want you to do at work. The puzzle they're asked to solve. You've got 9 dots. Connect those dots with 4 straight lines without lifting the pen from the paper or going back on yourself. And you try various ways, and it's just not possible to do that. Well, here's the solution. Outside the box. The instructions never did say you had to stay inside the box. It just said you had to connect the dots. So we encourage our teams to think outside the box, is the moral of this story. But does it matter when encouragement is a command performance? Now, General MacArthur cordially encourages your presence at today's briefing about 0600-ish hours. Better not. The Pope, may I suggest, who am I to tell anyone what's right or wrong? Can being outside one box be simultaneously being inside another box? What if you worked for Creativity Corporation and the boss said, you get back to that damn cubicle and start thinking outside the box? That's a command. Being outside the box. Have you stopped beating your wife yet? there are some questions you want to ask about these questions. The second order question: why should dream and job go together in the same sentence? Why should my inner psychic life, dreams, wants, desires, have to fit an external power structure, jobs? Bukowski's question. Is this a form of psychological slavery, masterless slavery, perhaps? I mentioned the work ethic, sometimes also called the Protestant work ethic, the gospel of work. Modern urban industrial middle class people, that's us, tend to identify psychologically with our jobs. We feel bad personally if we lose our jobs. We look down morally on the unemployed as scum bums. Yeah, people use those words. Because for us, work is not just a means to making an end, pour gagner mes radis, as the French say, earning my radishes. We go further. We have a work ethic and we have a gospel of work, and we may become workaholics. That is, addicted to work as an end in itself, not just as a means to other ends like satisfying our requirements for living. Workaholism is a possibility for us. You ever just looked at someone and knew the wheel was turning, but the hamster was dead? When does work ethic become workaholism? Workaholism, you know, like alcoholism and addiction, something which dominates your existence. Also like a religion, indeed, the original thesis was about the Protestant ethic, though the Japanese salaryman doesn't need religion to be a workaholic. Robert Bella, by the way, examined this in Japan as well. Look at the top workaholics in the world. Americans have the fewest vacation days, 13. You know, in France, everybody has 6 weeks. The entire month of August is holiday for almost all the French nation. There are a few people that stay behind, you know, kind of as a skeleton crew. But if you go to Paris in August, you can actually drive around the Arc de Triomphe. You see, you know, those film strips where people are you know, crammed in all the cars going, but there's nobody there. Parking is free. Now, there are a lot of restaurants which aren't open, but there are some which have to be. So, you know, you can just relax and have a leisurely time in Paris in August if you want to spend Paris in August, because everybody else is either up in the mountains or down to the beach, pretty much. In America, you work your way up to 2 weeks, maybe, but Americans tend to take only a few of those. Of the 13 days, they take 10 days. The Japanese have the second fewest number of holidays, 15 days, but they tend to take about half of them, and they go to work and catch up. And, you know, and people are available for email and, you know, online Zoom meetings and so forth. You keep your phone with you at the beach. That's, you know, that's a lot of work. No one ever died of hard work, so they say. Well, yeah, actually, some did. The Japanese have, appropriately, I guess, a word karoshi, death from overwork, stroke, heart attack, etc. Not limited by any means to Japan. Jeffrey Pfeffer, dying for a paycheck. My colleagues and I, he reports his research, looked at 10 different workplace exposures and their effects on health, things like economic insecurity, work-family conflict, long work hours, absence of job control. We found that they account for about 120,000 excess deaths a year in the United States, which would make the workplace the 5th leading cause of death and costs about $190 billion in excess health costs a year. So, is alcoholism slavery? Is workaholism slavery? If you don't have money to live, if you don't work, so you don't have money to live. If you work, there's no time to live. Bukowski again. The gospel of work. I believe in the gospel of work. There's no substitute under the heavens for productive labors, so said a major elder of the Mormon church. Other churches say more or less the same thing. It can take explicitly religious form, as in the Protestant ethic or in this motivational poster, but there are secular versions as well. Not all human beings, believe it or not, adhere to work as gospel. It's not human nature to do this. And this goes just to show how unusual our attitudes are in modern times. Max Weber, the classical German sociologist, asks this question in a famous book called The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, a little more than a century ago. He argues that attitudes toward work, the ones that we now have, changed drastically as a result of certain developments in the Protestant Reformation. Here's a story he tells in the book. Okay, so in Prussia, there were absentee landlords who owned large farms, and they employed the peasants as wage laborers to cut the grain grown on these farms. And they did it this way, just the way this picture shows, by hand with size and so forth. Now, they hit on a plan. They paid their workers a piece rate. They said, let's increase the piece rate, and that'll motivate the workers. They'll start cutting more so they can earn more money. So we'll get more money from selling the grain. It'll grow more grain. We'll sell it more quickly. It's a win-win situation, right? Rising profits are going to parallel rising wages. Great plan, except for one thing. The workers didn't respond as expected. Instead of working more, they worked less. They worked to rule, basically. They worked so as they would get exactly the same wage under the new payment scheme as they would have under the old payment scheme, that is, by working less to get the same amount of money. Why? Because now they had more time to hang out at the tavern and drink. Time is money too. Were the peasants just being irrational? We might think of this instead as an instance of two competing views of what's rational, governed in turn by different ideas of what's valuable in life. The urban landlords had one set of values, the peasants had another. For the urban landlords, it's good to work harder and earn more money. For the peasant workers, time is money too, so it's good to work less and so as to enjoy your free time more, to enjoy more free time and enjoy it more, to dance and drink and party. The urban landlords, in other words, had a work ethic, and they assumed that this was human nature. Everybody else did too, but the peasants didn't. And so Weber's answer to how it is that the urban view came about was because of the Puritans and their ascetic Protestantism. But anthropologically, it's the Protestants with their work ethic, which then became generalized in secular form to the rest of the world, and we have that today. And even, even the Japanese salaryman doesn't have to be a worshiping Protestant, nor does anyone else, for this rule to have taken hold, which indeed it has. The peasant's attitude is the one that most human beings have had throughout most of human history. Most of our ancestors would not have been motivated by, wanting to work more and putting themselves in their identity into their work. No. It's just work is a curse. And that's what it was in the ancient world. It was not a value. It was a curse. What does Tanakh say? Book of Genesis. In the sweat of thy face shalt thou eat bread, till thou return unto the ground. For out of it wast thou taken, for dust thou art, and unto dust thou shalt return. That's what the angel told Adam and Eve when he kicked them out of the Garden of Eden for their sins. So in our religious legends, why is it that we have to work? Because we're cursed. We could have stayed in the Garden of Eden and had all our needs taken care of. That was what God had intended, but no, we screwed it up. We had to take that forbidden fruit, and we, being our parents, great-grandparents, Adam and Eve, kick them out, and the rest of us out, have to get our bread by the sweat of our brow ever since. And on the eighth day, a Monday, God created jobs. The Greeks had this attitude too. As we shall see when Socrates gives his speech at the end of his trial, he says that he's been sentenced to death and his accusers have sentenced themselves thereby to wickedness, and wickedness is swifter than death. The word he uses for wickedness, that's a kind of a mistranslation in English, is a bowdlerization. It's a root word meaning slavishness and labor by sweat. You are low down, sweaty, grubbing people. That's what he's basically saying to them. It's a terrible insult in his world. In the ancient Homeric value system, there's hardly a worse insult than to call someone a sweaty worker. You called him low down, you called him trailer trash, basically. That's what Socrates is saying. So what do the ancients and the peasants value in place of work? Okay, one of the big fantasies, it's kind of a folk tale now from peasant society, Schlaraffenland, goes by different names in different cultures. The land of cocaine, German it's Schlaraffenland, Leukirland to the Flemish, Olean to the Norwegians. In Olean, the land is free, the wheat and corn just plant themselves, there they grow for feed a day, well on your bed you rest yourself, Olean. Lots of versions of this. And, you lie around and roast birds just fly into your mouth. Sausage grows on trees. Roasted pigs run around with knives and forks. You could cut off a slice. To get into Schlaraffenland, it is surrounded by a mountain of cake, and you have to eat your way through the mountain in order to get to the land itself. This is a peasant fantasy. This is a fantasy of people who have to work hard and have very little food, just on the margins of subsistence. And when they think about what they would like, what's their dream job, that's what it is. Utopia, in other words. Schlaraffenland is a utopia. Problem is nobody believes in utopia anymore. Politicians see higher education simply as training. Training is for jobs in STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math. And again, left and right don't disagree on this. The Republican administrations have exactly the same education policy as folks like Obama and the Clintons. Yeah, so what are you in school for? In school for a job. Higher education, though, thrives on leisure. And today has little to say in favor of utopia. 40 years ago, this could have been one of my professors, with the hippie hair, which I'm not, but because of the pandemic, I'm starting to become an aged hippie. I'll get there. Not up here, but yeah. But we had dreams of leisure and not having to work. Technology taking over for our benefit. Actually, John Maynard Keynes, longer ago than that, in the 1930s, said his grandchildren by the turn of the 21st century going to be working only 15 hours a week. How's that working out? Well, what is the future of work? It's changing. Could everybody be employed? Could everyone who is employed work less than 40 hours? Could there be a minimum annual income decoupled from work? We're beginning to ask these sorts of questions now. We'll see where that goes. David Graeber, interesting guy, an anthropologist at London School, has a book called Bullshit Jobs. And his point isn't that some jobs are nasty. That's not what a bullshit job is. A bullshit job is a full-time job which only requires part-time work to do properly. And yet you have to stay on the job and make yourself look busy for most of your working week because it's defined as a 40-hour week. It's as if someone were out there making up pointless jobs just for the sake of keeping us all working, he says. As if. A bullshit job is a form of paid employment that is so completely pointless, unnecessary, or pernicious that even the employee cannot justify its existence, even though, as part of the conditions of employment, the employee feels obliged to pretend that this is not the case. It's worth a look. And today, what's happened to utopia? Well, Russell Jacoby at UCLA thinks that it's going. He teaches history there. Appalled by the bright students who go to a great university like UCLA, and they do so not to become cultivated, not to inquire, not to form their character, but they want to qualify for a job. And he's appalled also by the former students who are now teachers who see things exactly that same way. Here's his critique. Once upon a time, leftists and radicals, he's about my age, so it was when we were students, leftists and radicals talked of liberation and the abolition of work. Now the talk is about full employment. Though the ancient world understood that work was a curse, modern industrial society spreads its gospel. Kind of a grim view. Now, is expressing criticism of a work ethic in the way, for example, that Jacoby does, is this an invitation to slack off altogether, join the hobo jungle? Maybe not if we draw distinctions between things like jobs, careers, vocations. One might have a life's work, a vocation. This might or might not be facilitated by the paid job one needs to survive. Good example, Wallace Stevens, major American poet. He wasn't employed as a professor of poetry, certainly didn't get any money, paid by poem or anything like that. He worked as a banker for his entire career. And poetry he did in his own time, but it was his vocation, it was his passion, it's what he wanted to do, and apparently did well. A lot of musicians are like this. They may have a real vocation as an artist, but they got to have a day job in order to do their gig work. I'm always fascinated by buskers. Here's Leo Pellegrino and Too Many Zoos. They're just doing a busking thing in 14th Street Union Square subway station. But these are guys that I would pay to hear in a club. In fact, Leo's gone on now. He's very famous. But used to be able to hear him, on the street for spare change. And a lot of musicians are like that. They really develop a talent. They've got a love, and nobody's paying them. Yeah, they have a vocation, but they don't necessarily have a job based on that vocation. So, go back to Steve Jobs and all this advice about following your dreams. Is it really reasonable to expect, as the motivational rah-rahs would have it, that every day job can and will be some kind of heartfelt vocation like poetry or music or what have you. Follow your dreams, canceled, and don't quit your day job. Or pay attention to Alfred Adler. Follow your heart, but take your brain with you. There are, those who do and those who do not need a day job. There are such things as trust fund babies. Trust fund baby is somebody whose parents set up a fund that keeps them going for the rest of their lives. Why couldn't I be a trust fund baby instead of my parents are too busy having unprotected sex with no financial plan baby? Why didn't I benefit from lucky sperm? There are some people who have to work, wage slaves. At least if they don't work, they don't eat. Very many such people. There are also a few who don't have to work, ever. I love this line by Maggie Smith. Dame Maggie was on the show Downton Abbey, and she plays the Dowager Baroness, I think. There were a bunch of people down to their country house from London for the weekend, and that was a common thing to do at the time. And she says quite innocently, they're talking about being down for the weekend. She says, "What is a weekend?" Well, for someone like her, every day is Saturday. You're not working for the weekend because you're not working. The harder you work, the luckier you get, says this guy. Yeah, the beneficiary of lucky sperm. Self-made man because his father gave him money. Are trust fund babies smarter or otherwise better than the many wage slaves? They talk to us about givers and takers, but again, this guy did inherit some money, born on third base, and thinks he earned a triple. What does Bertie Russell say? Choosing your parents, most important decision in life. Okay, I guess he made that decision wisely, more wisely than some of the rest of us. Of course, we say of him he was born on third base and thinks he hit a triple. Actually, in his case, it's more like this. He was born on third base and then stole second. But is it possible, it is possible at least, to live without ever having the expectation of work or the desire for work? Somebody actually owns this yacht. I like to go to Cannes, south of France. There's a lot of money in Cannes, a lot of big yachts. And I go to the beach, and I'm in a fairly modest section of the beach, but I look over and there are these huge yachts. And people, this is just their vacation home. They've got mansions wherever, but there are people who live like this. And never go to lunch with a rich man because they have no idea what money is. Money is like oxygen and sex. It's only if you're not getting enough, it's really important. But if you have a ton of money, it's like Maggie Smith in The Weekend. What is a weekend? What is money? You don't really notice. Why is that? When asked the question, "What's your dream job?" some people jump immediately to an answer like this. I want one of those jobs where people ask, "Do you actually get paid for this?" Instead of jumping to an answer like this one, "My dream job is not needing one." Yeah, follow your dreams. My dream is a bungalow house in LA with a white picket fence. Why is this my dream house rather than this? Or this? Or this? Just earlier this year, Jeff Bezos, who, by the way, on the way to becoming the world's first trillionaire, bought the Jack Warner estate from David Geffen, $165 million, highest price ever paid for a house in Los Angeles. There it is. It's better than a whole city block. It's the green bit around the black and white. If our first order wants for a job or a small house or a dream it might be are defined by second order wants, which are just a matter of social conditioning. For example, I got to have a job. I like having a job. It's ethically obligatory for me to have a job or to be psychologically fulfilled by a job, and not to want a job makes me a morally bad person. Well, it's a good question. Are we free? Wage slavery or starvation? That's not a choice. That's a threat. These guys, do they have a choice? If we cannot not want to want what we want, in what sense are we choosing what we say we want first order? Is it possible to be boxed into being outside the box? If I am not determined by external conditions, but I'm still unfree, am I the one who is imposing this unfreedom on myself? Is it possible to be a masterless slave to impose that upon myself? And what of the future of work? Is there a possible world in which work can be abolished, or is the no job always just a dream? Did Keynes have a point when he said that his grandchildren would be working 15 hours a week? These are not just rhetorical questions. And, things have changed. The weekend was once a utopian dream. And now, except Maggie Smith, we all kind of take it for granted. If you enjoy the weekend, thank the labor unions, by the way, particularly the Jews in the labor unions, because the weekend combines both the Christian Sunday and the Jewish Sabbath, both holidays off together. The work week was limited to 5 days and 40 hours. Previously, it would have been 6 or 7 days, maybe 60, 70 hours, maybe unlimited hours. On the other hand, be careful what you work for. 40 years ago, futurists predicted that we would be free from work. Apparently, that day has arrived. Okay. I will continue here. I think we'll go ahead and do this all in one take. Properties and predicates. What is a chair? Philosophers tend to use chairs as examples. I don't know why we do. Well, a metaphysicist would want to know, what is the chair really in itself? And there are two options here: the bundle view and the substratum view. Okay? One way to answer the question, what's a chair, is to describe the properties of the chair. Properties are predicates in any sentence which has the subject chair. So look at this chair, for example, has some properties. It is blue, has a color. It has arms, not all of them do. It has a back. It's stuffed, not all of them are. It's covered with fabric. It has legs. So various kinds of properties. We may be tempted to say the chair is the sum total of its properties. The whole is just a matter of the sum of its parts. It's a thing that's blue, stuffed, covered with fabric, has arms and legs. But if this is so, do I really know what the chair is, or do I just know what the sum of the properties is? Suppose I subtract the properties. Is there any chair left? Well, peel an apple. This is the bundle view, and mostly the apple remains. Peel an onion, and there is no more onion. The onionness of an onion lies in the bundling, in the peel. Likewise, the chairness of a chair may lie in the bundle of properties that make it up, such that if one peels these away, there's no more chair. So on the bundle view, how do I know it's a chair? Isn't it simply by means of the chair's properties? And if I remove all the properties, don't I just remove the chair? So I have this comfy blue armchair. Now suppose I start subtracting the chair's properties in a way that I might peel an onion. But my chair has no color, not much of a shape either. It has no legs. My armchair has no arms, doesn't have a back. Dude, where'd my chair go? The onion view, bundle view. Another possible answer is the substratum view. We could think of the chair as like a pincushion and the properties as the pins, but there's an underlying substratum, the pincushion, that holds them all together. So that if I remove the pins, I've still got the pincushion, the substratum remaining. Is the chair like this? Okay. Basic view then, the substratum view, the pincushion, and the bundle view of the onion. Let's apply this view to a particular question, the question of God. What's God like? Is God more like a pincushion or more like an onion? There's a famous application of this, Anthony Flew and John Wisdom, the invisible gardener parable. It goes like this. Two explorers, one's a believer, one's a skeptic. They come across a clearing in the jungle. Looks like a garden. Many weeds and flowers in there. One says, oh, some gardener must tend this garden plot. The other says, no. So they pitch camp, they watch. Well, they don't see anybody. Well, he might be like H.G. Wells' Invisible Man. So they set up an electric barbed wire fence. They patrol with bloodhounds. Still no sign. The believer still says, oh, but there is a gardener, invisible, intangible, and sensible to electric shocks. A gardener has no scent and makes no sound. A gardener who comes secretly to look after the garden which he loves. Skeptic despairs. But what remains of your original assertion? Just how does what you call an invisible, intangible, eternally elusive gardener differ from an imaginary gardener or no gardener at all? So, our invisible gardener. And the believer says there is a gardener and he's there, and the skeptic says, doubt it. So the believer seems to hold a substratum view of God. Even if we unbundle all the perceivable properties, the substance still remains. The skeptic has a bundle view. God is like an onion. Unbundle the onion, and where's that onion? And they both take the same evidence as evidence for their differing points of view. The absence of any visible evidence is evidence that the gardener exists, the invisible gardener. The absence of any visible properties is evidence that no gardener exists. Same exact evidence, opposite conclusions. H.L. Mencken defined the difference between a philosopher and a theologian in the following way. The philosopher, he says, is a blind man in a dark room looking for a black cat that isn't there. And the theologian, theologian is the man who finds it. Well, back to our invisible gardener. Doesn't absence of evidence show that belief in the gardener is just false? And the skeptic might ask, why do we even have this idea of an invisible, intangible, eternally elusive gardener in the first place? Immortal, invisible, God only wise. Where does that come from? Well, there's a history to this. Making God remote in this way can be a defense against challenges to the existence of God. Invisibility was an early strategy. The pagan gods were capricious, not particularly morally exemplary. The Christians, the Muslims, the Jews came up with invisible gods. They were more ethereal. They were perhaps a little better behaved and more high-minded. There is the via negativa. We can't grasp the greatness of God because we're merely mortal, so we can just say whatever appears to us is false, but God's still there. And another strategy has been to immunize religious claims from falsification such that no amount of evidence can count against them. Now, there have been times and places in which an invisible God would have seemed just absurd. The gods of Mount Olympus, they took visible form. Artworks depict them all the time. Here's the ceiling of the room in Hampton Court Palace, very typical. There was a ruler of Athens named Pisistratus. He pranked the citizens. He hired a woman to dress up as the goddess Athena, put her in his chariot, and drove around the city. Everybody could see there he is with the goddess, and they all believed it, because it wasn't implausible to them, as it would be to us, that you could actually see a god. But, we think that's implausible now. So not all religions insist that God is so far above humans and the rest of creation as our more familiar religions, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam do. But several problems make the invisibility option attractive to religious believers. Two things in particular. One is what we can call the God of the gaps, and the other is what we can call theodicy. For the God of the gaps, God is just a word we insert for ignorance. Science shrinks ignorance, but as knowledge grows, therefore God must inevitably decline. And theodicy has to do with the fact of evil. We'll come back to that. God is just a word we insert for our ignorance. As our ignorance shrinks, so does God. Human beings have figured out quite a lot about nature. And, I talked about this a little earlier. We still have to work out consciousness. That's still a big problem. There are some other problems too, but we have worked out quite a lot. There are gaps, however. They remain, increasingly fewer, but they're there. Ever since Thales explained the eclipses, remember, what made that important was that things that people used to say, well, it's, eclipses are the gods and the demons fighting. No, we don't say that anymore. We can say, we have a physical explanation for this. Ever since Thales did this, acts of God have a shrinking explanatory value. We see lightning, we see electrical discharge. It's not Zeus with his thunderbolt. It's not Yahweh. It's not Baal. They were all high sky gods that were gods of thunder. Also, well, your science can't explain everything. There are unexplainable events. This is a gap. And so sometimes a deus ex machina, a god in the gaps, is lowered down to explain those events. When you can explain things, do. If not, just put God in, and that takes care of it. God comes to be invoked only when there are gaps in our naturalistic explanation. Does the phrase God did it mean anything more than I don't know why? We talk about acts of God not being covered in insurance policies. God only knows, as the Beach Boys say. Eventually, there's no need to invoke God at all. Marquis de Laplace, I mentioned him a little earlier, his demon. Napoleon confronts him at one point and says, they tell me you've written this large book on the system of the universe and have never even mentioned its creator. And Laplace said to Napoleon, sorry, I had no need of that hypothesis. And indeed, increasingly, people do not. We've got it now. In response to the shrinking role for God in natural explanation, one strategy is to embrace the development, abandon the traditional theology altogether, and say that God is not some sort of Aristotelian prime mover, not some sort of first cause of nature, but think of him as entirely above the fray. The frontier of knowledge is pushed ahead, and if God is across that frontier, then it's going to get pushed back. So here's a major German Protestant theologian from the 20th century, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who protests against using this God in the gap explanation. He says it's completely wrong-headed from a religious point of view. How wrong it is, says Bonhoeffer, to use God as a stopgap for the incompleteness of our knowledge. If, in fact, the frontiers of knowledge are being pushed further and further back, and that is bound to be the case, then God is being pushed back with them and is therefore continually in retreat. We are to find God in what we know, not in what we don't know. Okay, so there's a religious protest against the God of the gaps. There's a secular articulation of this view. Stephen Jay Gould, what he calls non-overlapping magisteria, NOMA, it's sometimes abbreviated. Science gets the age of rocks, and religion, the rock of ages. Science studies how the heavens go, religion, how we go to heaven. So there's a division of labor. East is east and west is west, and there the twain shall or need meet. Perhaps your idea is that the ingredients for life were there, but something special had to happen to turn those chemicals from gunky soup into life. Well, maybe that's the bit God did. That's a common sentiment one hears. But the bit that God did, well, in traditional stories, God didn't do a bit, he did it all. Not even just most of them. So that's a problem. Then there's a problem with theodicy. The fact that there is evil seems to falsify the idea that God is both omnipotent and omnibenevolent, morally good. Traditionally, the notion of God is a three-legged stool. God is omniscient, all-knowing, omnipotent, all-powerful, omnibenevolent, all-good. But if so, why is there evil? The Stoic philosopher Epicurus. Is God willing to prevent evil but not able? Then he's not omnipotent. Is he able but not willing? Then he's malevolent. Is he both able and willing? Then whence cometh evil? Is he neither able nor willing? Then why call him God? I said Stoic philosopher. I'm sorry, I meant Epicurean philosopher. Obviously, Epicurus. Here's the problem in a Punnett square. Can God be both good and all-powerful? Okay, that's one possibility. What if he's good but not all-powerful? He wants to stop suffering, but he can't. God's using a walker. What if he is all-powerful, but he's not good? He could stop suffering, but he doesn't. Don't bother him. Go away. What if he's neither all-powerful nor all-good? He can't stop suffering and he doesn't want to. Maybe he's a kind of an evil genius. Even assuming that God smites the wicked, that destruction and that sort that comes down on people, how is it that, and quite often, innocent children suffer horrendous damage and death? How do you get something like this outcome? As David Hume noted, even if you proved the very existence of God, it wouldn't necessarily follow that the orthodox list, the three-legged stool, is necessarily the case. God might be all-powerful and yet not all-good or all-knowing, or a combination. One way to settle the problem of theodicy would conclude that God is not simultaneously omnipotent and benevolent. Well, Gabe, I've finally come to my senses, and I now realize you were right all along. Right about what? Problem of evil. There's just no way it makes sense to believe the world was created by a perfectly loving, omniscient, omnipotent being. That's great, Nestor. Welcome to the wonderful world of atheism. Who said anything about atheism? I just decided to believe in omniscient, omnipotent, perfectly malevolent God instead. I knew this was too good to be true. Yeah, maybe it's easier to believe in the devil than it is to believe in God. In any case, the universe isn't always forthcoming with answers. Question who was up there, okay? All the cruelty and hatred and injustice down here. What's the point? His friend helpfully says, maybe it's our job to supply the kindness, love, and justice to counteract all the cruelty. Okay, shut up, Charlie. I'm trying to listen for an answer. Not always forthcoming. When one points out to believers, for example, that dead babies contravenes the assertion that God is both all-powerful and all-good, not malevolent, religious believers often invoke some kind of ad hoc principle. Well, God moves in mysterious ways we can't understand, or this isn't God's fault. This is brought about by human sin. And this explains away the supposed counter evidence. But think back to the parable of the invisible gardener. Some people conclude there cannot be a God who is both omnipotent and benevolent, while other people, given the same evidence, or lack of evidence, double down on their faith. God is supposed to be all powerful, all knowing, and all good, yet isn't there evil in the world? That's proof against God. Not at all. The problem of evil is actually proof for God's existence. If all that stuff you said is true, it means that someone messed up the universe. Inanimate objects don't make mistakes. Therefore, whatever made this universe must be animated. QED, there is a God. It's a new proof. They pay you to come up with this stuff? That's messed up. Hallelujah. Well, the fact that nature is not explained as acts of God, the fact that evil persists even though God is thought to be both omnipotent and benevolent, each of these raises problems for the traditional belief in God as this has developed in major world religions. The latter problem, theology, is old. Think about Epicurus. It's one with which all religions grapple one way or another insofar as all insist that some kind of cosmic justice. It is a central problem in religious thought. The notion of karma is one way of getting what goes around comes around, but not necessarily in this life. Martin Luther King, the arc of the moral universe has long been advanced toward justice. We're getting there, slowly but surely. Or, wait for your reward in heaven. Joe Hill, the labor organizer who was shot by the copper bosses. You will eat by and by in that glorious land above the sky. Work and pray, live on hay. You get pie in the sky when you die, by and by. The Preacher and the Slave, one of his songs. The former problem, the God of the gaps, also old. Think about Thales. But it takes on new intensity with the Enlightenment, new intensity with the success of science. One response to these problems of driving God into the gaps and the problem of theodicy is to adopt what's an old theological strategy called via negativa, the way of negating. In negative theology, it is accepted that the divine is too ineffable, too greater extreme to be expressed in words. Whatever you say about God is not true. Saint Augustine gives voice to this. Se enim comprehendis non est Deus. If you understand something, what you understand is not God. God is not what you imagine or what you think you understand. If you understand, you have failed. In modern times, the German theologian Karl Barth, the God who stood at the end of some human way of knowing would not be God. So negating every property of God that humans can imagine might be a way to eliminate false gods. God's not the old man with the beard, not the hairy cosmic muffin thunderer with the bolts of lightning, all that kind of stuff. Well, that might be the first step to zeroing in on who an actual God really is. But back to the invisible Gardner parallel. If you unbundle, this is the via negativa, if you unbundle all the properties of God, what happens? Well, this might be like Michelangelo saying, somebody said, how did you carve that fabulous statue of David? Michelangelo took a block of stone that no other sculptor would work with. They said, you can't do anything with this block of stone. And he carves the Michelangelo, or the David statue. He says, well, I just chipped away everything. It didn't look like David. It was easy. That the David was really in there, and just all the other bits of stone were just irrelevant. If God is like the pincushion, then perhaps subtracting all of his traditional properties just gets us away from the pins, but leaves the cushion. So God's not omniscient. He's not a prime mover. He's not omnipotent. He's not benevolent. He's not a miracle worker. He's not a creator. He's not that bearded guy and the Sistine Chapel, all that kind of stuff. Well, what is he? Is he a pincushion or is he an onion? Here's a semantic consideration of subjects and bundles. We get this in combination from both Immanuel Kant and from Ludwig Feuerbach. I'm going to talk about Feuerbach here now, but the very last lecture in the course, I'm going to explore some more about Feuerbach's ideas of religion. They're actually quite interesting. But let's start with Kant. Think about how we use language. We form sentences. A sentence is a subject related to a predicate. Something is predicated of the subject. What is the subject of any sentence, if not merely the bundle of properties, though, predicated about that subject? If that's so, then what happens to the subject if I subtract the predicate? Well, here's what Kant says. If in an identical proposition, I reject the predicate while retaining the subject, contradiction results. And I say, therefore, that the former belongs necessarily to the latter. Predicates belong to the subject. On Kant's view, it would seem that everything is like an onion in the sense that you can never get beyond the phenomenal peel to some noumenal essence or substratum. Think about a cat, for example. Okay, there's my subject, what can I predicate about the cat? Well, the cat has whiskers, the cat has a tail, the cat is furry. Okay, suppose, like the onion, I start peeling away these predicates. So I say, no, the cat does not have whiskers, does not have a tail, is not furry. I negate them all. Well, the cat begins to disappear. And then finally, like the Cheshire cat, nothing is left but his smile. What if we apply the same process to talk about God? Okay, so God, subject, predicate, is omniscient, is omnipotent, is benevolent. I start peeling those things away. Where's that onion? The triangle is there, but the substance has disappeared. Feuerbach claims that since the properties of God are the best properties of man, the true subject of those predicates must be man. That's where he's going to go. We'll take that up toward the last lecture. And notes that that which has no predicates has no effect upon me, and therefore does not exist for all intents and purposes. So this purports to be a defense of God, but it's actually not. Think about the armchair. I have this comfy blue armchair, but by the way, I start stripping the properties away. My blue chair has no color, not much of a shape, no legs, no arms, no back. Hey, dude, what happened to my chair? What's the difference between my comfy blue armchair and no armchair at all? Likewise, if we pick apart the predicates of God, what happens to God? Speaking semantically, if we deny all the predicates, don't we therefore deny also the subject, whether in the case of the cat or in the case of God or in the case of the onion, for that matter? So making God out to be wholly other, out to be ineffable, as Karl Barth does, for example, as St. Augustine does, it's one way to defend the rationality of belief in God, but what purports to be a defense may actually turn out to be its opposite. Here's Feuerbach again. The negation of the subject with delicate God is held to be irreligion and atheism, not so the negation of the predicates, but that which has no predicates has no effect on me, and that which has no effect on me has no existence for me. To deny all the qualities of a being is equivalent to denying the being himself. The theory that God cannot be defined and consequently cannot be known by man is therefore the offspring of recent times, a product of modern unbelief. What purports to be a defense of God may turn out to be its opposite. And Feuerbach goes on, and again, we'll talk about this in the last lecture. What was at first religion becomes at a later period idolatry. What yesterday was still religion is no longer such today, and what today is atheism, tomorrow will be religion. So if things are bundles of their predicates, and the predicates of God are ineffable, then for all intents and purposes, the subject God may not exist, may as well not exist. On the other hand, maybe God is a substrate instead. So here's an interesting cartoon. Jesus and Mo, the conceit is they live in contemporary Britain, they share a flat, and they go down to their local pub together for a pint, and the bartender is an unbeliever, so they both, in their own denominational ways, Jesus obviously is a Christian, Muhammad is a Muslim, they try to convince her otherwise. But I won't read this to you. You can read it on your own when you get the PDF, the handout. Whereof you can't speak, shut up. Whereof one cannot speak, there one must remain silent. If you're going to take the via negativa, then you can't draw a conclusion. Okay, and then the topic of human nature, still under the notion of metaphysics. Metaphysics is often construed as about being in general, questions about the cosmos, about time, about causation, etc. But it's possible to ask about human beings also. What does it mean to be human? The existentialists, social and political philosophers, philosophical anthropologists also ask this kind of question. Of course, it's been asked before philosophy for a very long time. Think about, again, Tanakh. What is man, says the psalmist, that thou art mindful of him, and the Son of Man that thou visitest him? For thou hast made him a little lower than the angels, and hast crowned him with glory and honor. Thou madest him to have dominion over the works of thy hands. Thou hast put all things under his feet. Or by Shakespeare, what a piece of work is man. How noble in reason, how infinite in faculties, in form and moving, how express and admirable, in action, how like an angel, in apprehension, how like a god. The beauty of the world, the paragon of animals. Although in the same play, Shakespeare has Hamlet say, oops, okay. Don't know why this keeps popping up on me. Anyway, right. Life is a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. On the other side of the ledger, of course, the Judeo-Christian religious heritage tells us that it is the nature of humans to be wicked and corrupt, that we suffer from original sin. Sometimes social and political philosophy has followed this up. Thomas Hobbes, why do we need a king? We need a king because humans are selfish. Without that sort of restraint, life would be poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Rousseau suggests in A State of Nature, man may not be particularly good or particularly bad, but society corrupts us. But humans are naturally greedy, says Robin. Batman slaps him. Humans are greedy because we created a paradigm that necessitates it. People talk about socialism and capitalism. The idea of human nature comes up. Does human nature make socialism impossible? Are humans just not capable of cooperating? Counter-argument is that capitalism has been about for relatively few centuries. Greed has been about for quite a number of centuries. Probably one's not the other. Or perhaps, as the existentialist suggests, there's no human nature at all. Jean-Paul Sartre famously, existence precedes essence. We're free to do anything except to be unfree, and there's no good or bad independent of our choices. But even if Sartre is correct, then paradoxically humans do have a nature. It's simply our nature to have no fixed nature. Denying human nature turns out itself to be a doctrine of human nature. There is a species of philosophical anthropology associated, among others, with Arnold Galen, Helmut Plessner, so forth. Precisely because we have no common given nature as animals, we compensate by forming our own diverse cultures, and that is a kind of backhanded sense of human nature. Here's Konrad Lorenz, a famous student of animal behavior, founder of ethology, and he's working with waterfowl who have an imprinting instinct. Basically, they have an instinct hardwired into their nervous system by their genetic code, which tells them, in effect, follow, pattern on the first moving object after you hatch. And so he hatched these eggs, and normally the first moving object would be their mother, but they patterned on him, and they followed him until they got mature, and then they took off and did their own, duck or goose thing, whatever the case may be. Other species have a lot by the way of instincts like imprinting. Human beings don't. Anybody ever have a dog? You ever seen a dog circle around before it goes to bed? What's it doing? Well, the dog is trampling down the grass. Well, now, my dog does this on my carpet and on my bed, but I have no grass there. No, but this is a tropism, behavioral taxis, that got hardwired into dogs' genetic code because they evolved in grasslands, and they would trample down grass to bed down. The grass is gone, but the instinct is still there. By and large, all other species have a lot of instincts. Our species has very few. So perhaps it's our nature to have no nature in the sense of instincts. This is what Sartre says in his early existentialist works. Later on, Sartre repudiated some of his earlier ideas and came to become a follower of Karl Marx. But Marx also had a similar view. Why is it that humans revolt in the first place? Why is it that they don't simply knuckle under? There seems to be something about humans that causes them to revolt. As late as the early 20th century, we find Sartre tackling metaphysical problems. Some people would say we no longer need metaphysics, but he concluded in his, we talked about, well, actually I've talked about in the other talk about the handout, there are only two categories of being. We humans are of one sort only, which he calls for itself, and then there follow from that some broad implications for human freedom and the general nature of being. But in general, it might be said, Sartre notwithstanding, that between the time of Aristotle, from whom we get the word metaphysics, and the present, metaphysics has undergone something of a decline. The reasons are complex and varied. When we talk about Descartes and Kant, as we will toward the end of the course, some of this will become clearer. Secondly, in the English-speaking world, there are the lingering effects of something called logical positivism. We talk about this more in the logic course. However, that's not to say that questions about time, determinism, causality, human nature, and so forth have gone away, nor that they've been solved definitively. St. Augustine observed, I know how to tell time, but I don't know what time is. Well, neither do we. Hume's annoying questions about causation and induction still provoke us. The metaphysical issues behind law and morality, determinism and freedom, they still remain. Post-Newtonian physics looks a lot more like where physics started way, way, way back. The 3 dimensions of our ordinary experience may not well represent what nature is like. We may have to talk about 7 dimensions in nature, 4 of which are not perceptible to the human sensorium, and so on and so forth. So one might not necessarily conclude from the fact that metaphysics seems to have undergone an historical decline that therefore it's possible pragmatically to avoid any metaphysics whatsoever. What Maynard Keynes said about economics applies here as well. Practical men, he says, who believe themselves to be quite exempt from any intellectual influence are usually the slaves of some defunct economist. Madmen in authority who hear voices in the air are distilling their frenzy from some academic scribbler of a few years back. And Edward Arthur Burt, even the possibility of trying to escape from metaphysics may be itself a form of metaphysics. We've already seen this in the case of Sauer. So is the attempt to dispose of metaphysics just one more instance of metaphysics? Perhaps it is. Okay, so I hope that now you have a better sense of what that first branch of philosophy, metaphysics, does. We'll end here, and the next lecture we'll pick up the second branch, which is ethics. Thank you, and good day.